In 1614, John Smith, who had helped establish a permanent British colony at Jamestown with Gosnold, charted the coastline of New England. He used Gosnold's name for the peninsula of Cape Cod. The voyage was famous for Smith having earned a fortune by catching 47,000 cod off the coast of America and selling them in southern Spain. In 1620, the Pilgrims set sail on the Mayflower and landed near Cape Cod. Hoping to catch cod and sell it for great sums of money too, they decided to settle there and name their colony Plymouth. Winter in Massachusetts. Okay, if you were thinking that the state that had that little kind of hook of land out was Massachusetts, you would be correct. During their first 2 years in America, the Pilgrims starved to death. Sorry, Pilgrims. Winter in Massachusetts was snowy and so cold that some Europeans believed that this new land was uninhabitable. Amen. I totally feel that. The hungry Pilgrims could have survived on dry cod as the Vikings had done further north, except the Pilgrims didn't know how to hunt or fish. Yikes. Nor did they know much about farming. Often they had to resort to stealing the hidden food reserves of the Native Americans. That's not a very smart game plan if you move to a country, a new land all by yourself, and you don't know how to hunt or fish or farm. I don't really know what they were thinking. These natives called themselves the Wampanoag. They made lines from vegetable fibers, made hooks from bones, and caught cod and other fish that swam near the coastline. They loved eating the clams they gathered on the shoreline and showed the Pilgrims how to pry them open. But the Pilgrims were not familiar with clams and would not eat them at first. Okay, picky eaters. Only in desperation, nearly starving, would they eat clams and lobsters, which grew to great size and crawled out of the sea onto the beaches. The Pilgrims were determined to succeed. They sent back to England for equipment and advice. They learned how to fish cod, dry it, salt it, and plow the fish waste into the soil for fertilizer. From Wampanoag, they learned about farming local crops such as corn, beans, and squash. Slowly, they became successful fishermen. They established fishing stations along the New England coast. Finally, they not only had food, but something valuable to trade. In the 1640s, they sold a record of 300,000 dried cod to Europe. The Cod Revolution. By the 1650s, New England was becoming an important commercial center. Cod from the coast of New England, Labrador, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia was brought to Boston and sold to merchants who shipped it to Europe. A city was being built around Boston's deep, sheltered harbor, and the waterfront was a forest of masts, crossbars, and rigging ships from around the Atlantic. One of Boston's leading trade partners was the Basque port of Bilbao. The Boston merchants sold cod to the Basques, and the Basques sold them oranges, wine, and products made of iron. More and more people moved to New England, not only to fish for cod, but to be merchants, shipbuilders, farmers, and craftsmen, carpenters, blacksmiths, barrel makers, furniture makers, to provide goods to a prosperous and growing colony. The cod trade transformed New England from a ragged pioneer outpost to a thriving society of growing cities and towns. Cod became a symbol of prosperity. In Massachusetts, carvings of cod decorated houses, churches, and government buildings. The merchant families of Boston who grew wealthy trading cod became known as the codfish aristocracy. The slave trade. This book is so long. As early as 1645, Boston cod traders became involved in the great crime of their time, the slave trade. For years, Europeans had imported slaves from Africa and sent them to the plantations of the Caribbean. Ships from New England sold high-quality salted cod to the Europeans, and then they traveled to the Caribbean. There, they sold the worst quality salted cod to the Caribbean plantations to feed the thousands of Africans forced to work all day in the tropical sun producing sugar. The Boston merchants would buy their molasses, which was made from sugar. Okay, so they had slaves working down here in the Caribbean on sugar plantations, and sugar plantations was like it was awful to be a slave, but working on a sugar plantation was the worst. I think their average lifespan was like 20 years because work was so hard. And so they would work really hard in this really, really rough heat, and then they would get, a piece of salted cod that was probably as hard as a piece of wood at the end of their day. So life was miserable. The American Revolution. No way. That's what we're talking about. The New England colonies were ruled by the British government. When the British king decided to control their rebellious colonists by taxing them on important trade items such as molasses and tea, the colonists were furious. They had been doing well without the British participation. Then, further laws were passed that limited even the rights of Americans to trade cod. But by then, the American Revolution had begun. From 1775 to 1781, 13 of the American colonies fought the British. The colonies of the far north, Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Newfoundland, remained in the British Empire. It was too cold for fish for cod in their northern winters, and so they did not develop as prosperous an economy as had given the lower 13 a feeling of independence. When in 1782 they began to negotiate peace with the British, the most difficult point to resolve was the right of the newly independent Americans to fish cod. No way. So remember how we had to make compromises on the Treaty of Paris? This is claiming that the most difficult compromise between the British and the Americans was over cod. A new kind of revolution. The 19th century was a time of great change for Europe and North America. The skies of Britain, France, Germany, and the United States were blackening with the soot from factory chimneys. Engine power was replacing manpower. The British learned to produce steel inexpensively, and soon steel was replacing wood. New ships were made out of steel and driven by powerful engines. At first, very little changed for fishermen. They still went to sea in wooden ships powered only by sails and lowered two-man rowboats in which to fish. The only modernization in the past few centuries had been that fishermen learned to bait a line a mile long with 1,000 hooks instead of a short line with 1 or 2. Because the 19th century was an age of newfound sciences, scientists began asking, are fishermen taking too many fish? If they had enough hooks, wouldn't they take all the fish out of the ocean? British scientists studied the ocean and the fish, both the herring that were used for bait and the cod that they caught with it. And by the 1880s, said that no matter how many fish fishermen took, there were so many fish in the ocean producing so many millions of eggs that the fishermen could go on taking as many as their boats could carry. So we got to think, were these scientists correct? Is this what we know from the start of the book? Can they take as many fish as they want and it won't impact anything? I think we're about to find out. Steel ships. In the 1880s, the British invented a large steel engine-powered fishing boat that dragged a large net to catch fish. The British were catching and eating large amounts of cod. It was a base for the most popular British meal, fish and chips, battered fried cod with French fries. Soon, all the nations in northern Europe fished with this type of boat. They all ate cod. The Danish ate it fresh with mustard for New Year's Eve. Sicilians ate salt cod for Christmas dinner. The Basque ate it salted with wonderful sauces. Caribbeans mashed their salt cod and ate it with hot peppers. The Portuguese fried it with potatoes. What would be your favorite way of eating cod? I feel like I'd be with the Portuguese. The Europeans caught many more fish with their new steel ships, but after 10 years there were fewer cod in northern Europe, and the new ships were not catching as many. So they built even bigger ships with even bigger nets and took even more fish. Let's stop and think. What do you think will happen when Europeans start fishing with their bigger ships and bigger nets? What clues on this page support your answer? What do you think will happen when the Europeans start fishing with their bigger ships and bigger nets? Is this a good idea? Is it a good idea for them to just make a bigger ship? 20th century. In the early 20th century, a young New Yorker named Clarence Birdseye went fur trapping in Labrador, Canada. He learned to freeze vegetables in the Arctic wind, and he could thaw them to feed his family during the long, cold winter. In 1924, he moved to the fishing port of Galchester, Massachusetts, and established a frozen fish factory. Now, there was more than just salted cod and fresh cod. Now, there was frozen cod. Machines cut fillets and put them in boxes. Other machines cut fish into sticks. Any of you ever had fish sticks? I actually never have, but they kind of look good. Frozen fish became popular food for school lunches and in homes all over the United States, especially in places ocean fish had not been available before, such as the Midwest. Shout out, we live in the Midwest. Fishermen learned how to freeze fish on their ships. Now, they did not have to return to a port to sell fresh fish. They could just haul up thousands of tons of fish in giant nets week after week and keep them frozen. Interesting. After World War II, submarine hunting techniques such as spotter airplanes and sonar were used to find the fish in the ocean. The nets scraped along the bottom of the sea for miles. There was no longer any place for the cod to hide. The last cod. Most of the fishing nations of the world started to believe that they no longer had enough fish in their waters to share with the fishermen of other nations. The Icelanders and the British even fought wars over who could fish for cod in the Icelandic waters. By 1975, after the third of these cod wars, Iceland declared that only their own fishermen could fish in the ocean within 200 miles of their shore. Soon, other nations followed and declared that same kind of zone. But the fishermen caught less fish because there were fewer and fewer fish left to catch. Not only cod were disappearing. Now an estimated 60% of the species of fish that are popularly eaten are showing signs of disappearing. Tuna, swordfish, and salmon are becoming scarcer in the Atlantic. And with fewer fish in the Atlantic, fishermen are now moving their big nets to the Pacific. There are still a few cod left in the North Atlantic Ocean. But governments and fishermen have to learn how to limit what they catch, or soon there will be no big fish left in the ocean. And then what will happen to the humpback whales, and the seals that eat the cod bellies, and the birds that eat the fish? And to the smaller fish that the cod eat, and to the smaller fish that they eat, and to the zooplankton and the phytoplankton? And what will happen to man if there's no more fish? Okay, let's stop and think. What does the author think might happen when fishing boats go to the Pacific Ocean? Use this text to support your answer. What does the author think might happen when fishing boats go to the Pacific Ocean? Is that a good idea? And then here is just a map of the world. So we sucked all of the cod out of the Atlantic Ocean, so now they're going to the Pacific, which is on the coast of like California and over here. Okay. Thank you for listening. Sorry it was like 5 hours long.